From Hormuz to the Black Sea, from the Danube to the Rhine, a new food crisis. Gürdeniz. The fundamental problem is no longer merely whether the world produces enough food, but whether food, fertilizer, and energy can be delivered to the regions where they are needed. Global food security entered a new and extremely fragile period in August 2026. As in the past, agricultural production, rainfall, arable land, population growth, and grain stocks have not lost their importance for food security, but they are no longer sufficient on their own. Other categories must now be considered as well. Modern agriculture depends on fertilizer. Fertilizer depends on energy. Production depends on transportation. Exports depend on ports. Ports depend on sea routes. And alternative transport corridors depend on railways and the flow levels of rivers. Developments across a vast geography stretching from the Strait of Hormuz to the Black Sea and from the Panama Canal to the Danube and Rhine in the summer of 2026 show that these seemingly independent elements are in fact links in the same global security chain. War, extreme heat, drought, low river levels, energy costs, vulnerabilities in fertilizer supply, and the approaching effects of El Niño are all converging at the same time. Therefore, the issue we now face is no longer merely rising food prices, but the danger that simultaneous disruptions at different points in the global food system could amplify one another. Europe's arteries are drying up. The extreme heat and drought affecting Europe in the summer of 2026 created severe hydrological stress on the continent's most important inland waterways. The most striking example occurred on the Rhine. At the critical Kaub gauging station west of the German city of Wiesbaden, the water level fell to 24 centimeters on August 3rd, the lowest recorded since measurements began in 1880. It should be noted that the 24 centimeters here does not represent the river's actual physical depth, but rather the reference water level used for navigation.
The economic consequences, however, remain the same. As water levels fall, the usable draft of vessels decreases. Barges can no longer carry full loads. More trips are required to transport the same volume of cargo, and freight costs rise. The Rhine is not an ordinary European river. It is one of the continent's main economic inland waterway arteries, connecting major ports such as Rotterdam and Antwerp with Germany's industrial centers, Switzerland, and Central Europe. The receding waters of the Rhine therefore affect not only river transport, but also the energy, chemicals, coal, petroleum products, and raw material logistics of European industry directly. The hydrological pressure seen on the Rhine is producing an even more geopolitical consequence on the Danube. Following the Russia-Ukraine war, the Danube is no longer merely one of Europe's major inland waterways. It has also become a strategic alternative corridor used to move Ukrainian grain to the Black Sea and from there to world markets. As Russian attacks put pressure on ports, terminals, and logistics infrastructure in and around Odessa, a significant share of Ukrainian grain was redirected through Rhine and Izmail to the Danube. From there, grain was transported downstream by barge and exported to world markets through Romania's port of Constanța. In this way, Constanța effectively became Ukraine's second gateway to the Black Sea after the war began. However, for this alternative system to function, there must be sufficient water in the Danube. As extreme temperatures and low rainfall reduced river levels in the summer of 2026, the usable draft of barges declined, the amount of grain that could be transported fell, and both the number of required voyages and freight costs increased. Thus, the war risk in the Black Sea and the climate risk in Europe are converging on the same logistic system.
While Russia's pressure in the Black Sea pushes Ukraine toward the Danube, drought reduces the Danube's carrying capacity. This creates a classic double bottleneck. If the Black Sea is unsafe, cargo shifts to the Danube, but if the Danube does not have enough water, rail and road transport are the remaining options. The decline in reservoir levels also shows that the hydrological pressure stretching from Western to Eastern Europe is neither temporary nor local. The problem today is therefore not merely the falling water levels of the Rhine or the Danube. It is the simultaneous pressure across a broad geography on the water systems that support Europe's transportation, agriculture, industry, and energy infrastructure. When water declines, energy supply tightens too. The strategic impact of drought is not limited to ships carrying less cargo. Thermal and nuclear power plants in Europe require large volumes of cooling water in their electricity generation processes. If both the amount of water in rivers decreases and water temperatures rise, power plants face pressure from two directions. On the one hand, obtaining sufficient cooling water becomes more difficult. On the other, the temperature of water discharged back into the river can exceed environmental limits, requiring power generation to be reduced.
On July 30th, 2026, Hungarian Prime Minister Péter Magyar said that the Paks nuclear power plant, which supplies roughly half of the country's electricity, might have to be shut down completely because the Danube had fallen to historically low levels. Some units at the plant were taken offline, while production at others was sharply reduced. A similar but more severe situation emerged in Romania. Reactor number 1 at the Cernavodă nuclear power plant, which uses Danube water for cooling, was shut down in a controlled manner on July 28th, followed by the second reactor on August 13th, leaving Romania's only nuclear power plant completely offline.
Thus, drought on the Danube evolved into a strategic crisis capable of hitting river transport, industrial logistics, and electricity generation at the same time. In other words, the same climate event is affecting both transport capacity and energy production. This is highly significant for food security. Modern agriculture is an energy-intensive activity. Energy is used at almost every stage of the food system, from fertilizer production and irrigation to tractors, storage, cold chains, and port operations. Drought, therefore, does not merely reduce output in the field, it also increases the cost of producing, storing, and transporting that output. The grain war in the Black Sea deepens. The importance of the combined war and drought bottleneck increased further with developments occurring simultaneously on both shores of the Black Sea in August. In July alone, Ukraine attacked 116 Russian vessels operating in the Sea of Azov, the Kerch Strait, and the Don River Basin. 2 major terminals used for Russian grain exports in Novorossiysk were hit and suspended operations. The Novorossiysk grain terminal, owned by Demetra Holding, had annual capacity of approximately 8.5 million tons, while the NKHP terminal had capacity of 7.1 million tons. As a result, a combined theoretical grain export capacity of 15.6 million tons per year was temporarily taken offline. After the attacks, Russia began redirecting grain flows to alternative ports and routes. However, the logistics congestion along the Azov-Don corridor is no longer a temporary issue. It has become structural. Moscow's preparation of a support package worth approximately 10 billion rubles to move grain and other cargo from Azov ports by rail to other Black Sea, Baltic, and Far Eastern ports illustrates how pressure on maritime transport is spreading into land infrastructure. The situation on the Ukrainian side is no different.
Due to the impact of Russian attacks, Ukrainian grain shipments during the first 2 weeks of August were reported to have fallen 76% compared with the same period a year earlier. In response, Ukraine and Moldova began developing alternative corridors that would move grain by rail through Moldova to Romania and the port of Constanța. The proposed capacity is 4.5 million tons per year, roughly 10% of Ukraine's total grain exports. Yet this is precisely where the problem of low water levels on the Danube emerges. Thus, it is no longer only Ukraine's grain exports that are under pressure in the Black Sea. Russia's are as well. Russia faces serious bottlenecks in Azov and Novorossiysk, while Ukraine faces them on the Danube and at Black Sea ports. As both sides increasingly try to shift cargo to rail and alternative ports, the roughly 3% rise in Chicago wheat prices following the Novorossiysk attack was an important sign that military developments in the Black Sea were beginning to feed directly into global grain markets. If Europe's low river levels and problems with transport on the Danube are added to this picture, the issue could move far beyond a regional logistics disruption and create a new wave of pressure on global grain prices and food security. Indeed, the effects of the escalating maritime trade war in the Black Sea are now being felt clearly in the diplomatic sphere as well. In a meeting with Egyptian President Sisi, Ukrainian President Zelensky warned that Russian attacks on commercial vessels in the Black Sea could cause serious disruptions to food shipments. Noting that Ukraine is one of the main suppliers of grain and food not only to Egypt, but also to many countries in Africa and the Middle East, Zelensky said shipments had already fallen significantly, and warned that continued disruption could lead to serious consequences such as price increases and food shortages.
The maritime trade war in the Black Sea is therefore no longer merely an extension of the military struggle between Russia and Ukraine. Through its cascading effects, stretching from grain export ports to the Danube and Europe's inland waterways, and from there to the food supply of Africa and the Middle East, it is evolving into a new crisis that directly threatens global food security. More importantly, there is no strong sign that tensions in the Black Sea will ease in the near term. Ukraine was reported to have proposed, via Turkey, that Russia agreed to halt reciprocal attacks on civilian vessels in the Black Sea. Such an arrangement could effectively have opened the way for a new safe grain corridor. Moscow, however, rejected the proposal. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova described Ukraine's attacks on commercial maritime transport as a policy aimed at destabilizing civilian maritime navigation and said they saw no justification for half measures that would give Kiev a temporary respite. In short, while war threatens the maritime export of grain from the Black Sea, water scarcity is narrowing the capacity of alternative river corridors. When the vulnerabilities surrounding Hormuz and global fertilizer and energy supplies are added to this picture, the issue is no longer simply war or simply drought. Maritime security, water scarcity, energy, fertilizer, transportation, and food security are becoming interconnected links in the same chain. If several links in that chain break at the same time, the consequences could become far more serious, ranging from price increases to actual food shortages, particularly in import-dependent regions such as Africa and the Middle East. Ultimately, the world's two most important grain exporters are both unable to access global markets at full capacity because of the same war.
When the severe decline in Ukraine's export capacity is considered alongside attacks on Russian ports and vessels, the issue ceases to be merely an economic loss for two countries at war and becomes a global food security problem. This is particularly important for North Africa, the Middle East, and low-income countries. A reduction of several million tons in grain trade may mean higher prices for wealthy countries, but for states that are highly dependent on food imports, the same development can create risks of social and political instability. The maritime trade war in the Black Sea is therefore not merely part of the military struggle between Russia and Ukraine. It is also a global factor increasing the vulnerability of the world food system. Land routes cannot replace sea transport. Here we confront the basic physical logistics of global trade. Sea transport, which is 7 times cheaper than land transport, cannot easily be replaced by overland transportation in terms of carrying capacity. This is particularly important for products such as grain, which have relatively low value per unit, but must be transported in very large volumes. Consider a medium-sized Panamax bulk carrier carrying roughly 60,000 tons of grain. Assuming that a truck in Europe carries approximately 25 tons of payload, transporting the cargo of a single ship by road would require about 2,400 trucks. Once customs delays at border crossings, fuel consumption, road capacity, traffic, and the return of empty vehicles are added to the equation, it becomes much easier to understand why maritime transport is indispensable. Although rail is far more efficient than road transport, it also faces serious capacity and infrastructure constraints. If the cargo carried by 2,400 trucks were transferred to rail wagons, around 1,000 wagons would be required. Ukraine's longest freight trains consist of roughly 50-60 freight wagons.
That would mean the equivalent of 15-20 freight trains operating at the same time, a level of capacity Ukraine does not have. Meanwhile, most of Ukraine's railway network uses the 1,520mm track gauge inherited from the Soviet system, while most of Europe uses the standard 1,435mm gauge. Although Ukraine has begun expanding EU standard railway lines in recent years, this difference still creates a major bottleneck at border crossings, requiring cargo transfers and other technical solutions. On top of this come limitations in wagons, locomotives, terminals, and border capacity. Indeed, as of August 2026, the annual capacity of the new railway corridor being developed between Ukraine and Moldova, with plans to reach the port of Constanța through Romania, is estimated at around 4.5 million tons. That amount represents only about 10% of Ukraine's total grain exports. European Commission data also show that as of June 2026, approximately 90% of Ukraine's exports of grain, oilseeds, and related products were still moving through the Black Sea. Therefore, while the idea that if the Black Sea closes, we will move the grain by rail is theoretically possible, it is not sufficient in practice when very large volumes are involved. Road and rail can support maritime transport and compensate for part of the losses, but they cannot fully replace the scale provided by Black Sea ports. El Niño enters the equation. On top of all this, the world is preparing for the effects of a new El Niño period. However, caution is required here. It would be incorrect to attribute Europe's drought in the summer of 2026 to El Niño. Hydrological stress in Europe began before El Niño's global effects had fully emerged. Nevertheless, El Niño, which began toward the end of spring 2026, represents a new risk factor that could spread existing vulnerabilities to other agricultural regions of the world in the period ahead.
El Niño does not produce the same effects everywhere. While it may increase rainfall in some regions, it can raise the risks of drought and extreme heat in others. As a result, different production problems could emerge simultaneously across regions, producing key commodities such as wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, sugar, palm oil, coffee, and cocoa. Another critical waterway crisis related to El Niño can be said to be emerging in Panama. As of August 15, 2026, Although conditions in the Panama Canal had not reached the severity of the 2023-2024 crisis, water-related pressure was increasing again. As the level of Gatun Lake fell because of El Niño-related drought, the maximum draft for Neo-Panamax vessels was reduced from 15.24 meters to 14.78 meters. This forces ships to carry less cargo. When the Hormuz crisis redirected energy traffic between Asia and the U.S. Gulf toward Panama, queues of more than 100 vessels and delays of up to 10 days emerged. Thus, drought in Panama and the effects of war around Hormuz are combining to put pressure on another critical choke point in global maritime trade. Hormuz is not just an oil strait. One of the most critical links in this global equation is perhaps the Strait of Hormuz. When Hormuz is mentioned, oil and LNG naturally come to mind. The Persian Gulf is one of the centers of the global energy system. Yet Hormuz has another strategic function for global food security that is nearly as important as oil. Gulf countries occupy an extremely important position in global ammonia and urea trade. The Gulf is also one of the world's major production centers for the energy and other raw materials required by the fertilizer industry. Modern industrial agriculture depends heavily on nitrogen fertilizers. One of the main inputs in nitrogen fertilizer production is natural gas. Natural gas is used to produce hydrogen, hydrogen to produce ammonia, and ammonia to produce key nitrogen fertilizers such as urea.
In simplified form, the chain is natural gas, ammonia, urea, agricultural productivity. Gulf producers dependent on Hormuz account for approximately 34% of global urea trade, 23% of ammonia trade, 49% of sulfur trade, and 18% of MAP/DAP phosphate fertilizer trade. In 2024 alone, approximately 18.5 million tons of urea reached world markets through Hormuz. Gulf countries' share of global nitrogen fertilizer exports is approximately 25%. A prolonged disruption in the strait would therefore directly affect urea and ammonia supplies, and through sulfur, indirectly affect phosphate fertilizer production, in addition to its impact on energy prices. The result would be higher fertilizer prices and higher costs for farmers, pressure on agricultural yields, and, after a delay of several months, higher food prices. For this reason, a serious disruption in the strait does not only raise oil and LNG prices, it also increases fertilizer costs. Unlike an oil shock, however, its effects emerge with a delay. When oil supply is disrupted, the price impact is visible almost immediately. With fertilizer, the main consequences may appear months later in the field. Fertilizer becomes more expensive, farmers' production costs rise, farmers in low-income countries in particular use less fertilizer, yields per hectare decline, and the next harvest may be smaller. A crisis occurring in Hormuz today could therefore affect next year's food production. Hormuz is no longer merely a strategic choke point for energy security, it is also one for global food security. From Hormuz to the Black Sea, the same security chain. When we look at the big picture, it becomes clear that regions separated by thousands of kilometers are actually parts of the same system. Hormuz brings a significant share of the energy and fertilizer inputs required by agricultural production to global markets. The Black Sea carries grain from Russia, Ukraine, and other producers in the region to world markets.
When war or a security problem emerges in the Black Sea, the Danube becomes an alternative transport corridor. The Rhine, meanwhile, forms one of the main arteries of Europe's industrial, energy, and inland logistics system. When the Panama and Suez Canals and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait are added to this system, it becomes even clearer just how strongly global food security depends on seas, straits, and inland waterways. The danger is not the closure of any single corridor. The modern system can create alternative routes and absorb individual crises to a certain extent. The danger is that several corridors lose capacity at the same time. When there is war in the Black Sea, cargo shifts to the Danube. When the Danube dries up, cargo is redirected to rail. When railway capacity proves insufficient, the burden shifts to road transport. When water levels fall on the Rhine, Europe's industrial, energy, and logistics costs rise. If El Niño reduces harvests in major production regions, the amount of agricultural commodities available to world markets declines. If fertilizer and energy flows through Hormuz are disrupted, the effects emerge in the following harvest season. In this way, crises that appear independent begin to reinforce one another within the same system. The world has experienced much more severe droughts, wars, oil crises, and agricultural production losses in the past. For this reason, it would not be accurate to describe the current situation as an inevitable global famine. Global grain stocks, the production capacity of major exporting countries, and alternative production regions provide significant flexibility to the system. However, the principal risk created by 2026 lies less in the scale of each individual crisis than in the possibility that they will converge during the same period. When high energy costs, insurance premiums, rising freight rates, and vulnerabilities in global supply chains are added, the situation becomes even more complex.
Conclusion: 21st century food security does not end in the field. In the past, when assessing a country's food security, it was largely sufficient to look at its agricultural land, rainfall, irrigation capacity, farmers, and grain stocks. All of these remain important today, but they now constitute only part of the equation. In the 21st century, food security is also a matter of energy and fertilizer security, the functioning of ports, the continuity of maritime transport, the navigability of rivers, railway capacity, and keeping strategic straits open. It is not enough for a country to produce grain. It needs an uninterrupted system capable of delivering fertilizer to the field, the crop to the port, and the ship to world markets. For many years, the global economy was built on the assumption that energy resources, maritime transport, river systems, and agricultural production would operate largely without interruption. Today, that assumption is increasingly losing its validity. The closure of a port in the Black Sea, falling water levels on the Danube and Rhine, an escalation of a crisis in Hormuz, drought in the Panama Canal, or El Niño damaging agricultural production can no longer be viewed as independent developments. Each affects a different link in the same global food chain. Therefore, the central question for the period ahead is not merely whether the world can produce enough food. The real question is whether the food, fertilizer, and energy that are produced can be delivered to the regions where they are needed, at the right time, at the right cost, and in the required quantities. Developments in the summer of 2026, from Hormuz to the Black Sea, from the Danube and Rhine to Panama and Suez, clearly reveal this new reality.
The failure of a single link in the system may raise costs. The failure of two links may create serious regional problems. But the simultaneous rupture of several links, driven by war, climate, energy, and logistics, could trigger a global food crisis. Food security in the 21st century will therefore be determined not only by how much is produced in the field, but by whether geopolitical, logistical, and climate security can be maintained at the same time.